Hi, and welcome to this workshop. Today we're talking about why timeouts will always fail and what to do instead. So we're really going to talk about building resiliency and how to do that in your everyday life. So you'll probably notice I'm in rural Mexico. Hey Deja, it's great to see you here. So we are in rural Mexico today and just really excited to be here with you. So I'm Dr. Chelsea Hague, and in just a moment, Dr. Robin Hague is going to be joining us. And, you know, we've just really been thinking about this timeout issue a lot. I think a lot of times people in my generation really don't use timeouts a lot. And yet, when I'm at play dates or when I'm at the park, I often see people starting to get really frustrated with their kids and then moving to timeout. So sometimes they call it something different. Like a lot of moms have thinking corners, or they'll call it time in, or they, like whatever it is, or kids start to, have to sit with on the bench for a little while. So I do see people using it a lot. And I think that the reason that happens is because we just don't know what else to do. So kids start to get really defiant or start to be really challenging, and there's not a lot of other options. We start to get frustrated, and it feels like this child is not doing the thing I'm asking, they're not obeying me, and I just don't know. I have no more tools sort of in my pocket that I can use in order to help them cooperate, and I'm starting to get frustrated. So then I move quickly to timeout, and I see it just happen all the time. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So I want to just briefly tell you a little bit about positive parenthood and how I got to be here, and then I'm going to invite Dr. Robin Hague in to join us. So a couple of years ago, I had 3 under 3, and I have a PhD in education, and for several years I've been working with kids and with young people. I had a lot of experience, a lot of research expertise, and I kind of thought, okay, this is going to be fine. Um, and then I had the 3 kids, and I realized I just did not know shit. And so that's kind of how I ended up at Positive Parenthood, where I really got the tools that allowed me to put all of that research that I was so familiar with into practice. And that's what we're really excited to share with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and invite Robin. There might be some interruptions. As you can tell, we're sort of outside. We're in rural Mexico, and there's kind of people around. So if that happens, please just bear with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm here. Great to see you.
So Positive Parenthood.
I'm going to pump.
Robin developed after several decades of working in the field, working with kids who are really, really challenging. She started at school. She's a speech pathologist, and she can tell us a little bit about her expertise. I do want to say before we start that we are supported and trusted by some of the major moms groups and parenting groups and educational institutions in the Bay Area and beyond. Regional Center of the East Bay, Wellspring, Soul Shop, and a couple of others. So welcome, Danae. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, Mom, and then we will move right into how to build resiliency instead of timeouts.
Absolutely. So I'm a speech language pathologist, and I've been working in the field for 35 years. And I think what's important to me is that I started by working in early intervention with children with autism. And as part of that work, I was doing a lot of parent training to support language development. And at the end of each of those classes, I would have families come up to me and say, gosh, what we really need help with is how to support behavior. And so I worked on this course. We had a guinea pig class that came through, and it's been refined many times since then. The class itself has been going for about 12 years. And the goal is to continue to provide this information to more families, because it's a different way of parenting. It's based really on how do we co-regulate with our children and teach them improved self-regulation skills.
Great. So let's talk about co-regulation, because that is really the main framework we use in order to think about behavior. So let's go back to just these memories that I have of being at the park with my kids and being with other moms and seeing moms start to get really frustrated. Say somebody's leaving the park, or a child isn't supposed to throw sand at another child, or are trying to share part of the play structure, whatever it might be. And the mom maybe asks the child, or dad asks the child to do something a couple of times. The child is defiant, doesn't do it. The mom asks quietly, gently, kindly a couple more times. And eventually she moves into sort of like a timeout, which she may call something different. It might be called like a thinking time, or something like that. So the child has some kind of period of time where they're not able to do it, and then gets up to play again. And usually what I see happen is that the kid does the thing again. They might be okay for a little while, but it happens again, and then the mom's really frustrated, so then they do the thing again. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, from a co-regulation framework.
Absolutely. So one of the things I think many parents don't realize is that their children take on their adult um, emotional energy. And so our children are hardwired, if you will, to take the adult energy, whether it's positive or negative. And oftentimes in a park, there are lots of little things that are happening that you may not be attuned to. You may not even be aware that are happening, where your child feels a perceived slight or something is going on. And the child responds with an inappropriate behavior, or what appears to be an inappropriate behavior. And our response then is, sometimes to try to give a little bit of redirection, but often the parents are talking to somebody and the child is, the idea is that the child's at the park and they're supposed to play and it's supposed to be fun, and why should the parent have to intervene? The parent should have parent time. And the reality is our kids need help learning how to play together and how to be with one another. And so when the parent goes up to that child who has just done something that's inappropriate and tries to correct him, what happens in that moment is the parent sends some upset energy, perhaps even some of their own personal embarrassment, into the child. And that all those emotions are confusing to the child. And they often, they may get scared into sort of complying, but they don't know how to cooperate at that moment. And that's the key difference. What we're talking about through co-regulation is how to teach the child to cooperate with you as the parent, to work together with you based on understanding your perspective, based on you understanding their perspective, and helping the child to experience a range of emotional states. It's okay, actually, for the child to be upset and to voice that upset, and we don't need to fix that upset. But just remember that in that park situation, Chelsea, that's where it's most likely that the parent's negative energy or upset energy, or we might call it red energy, is going to be pushed into the child, who will then be moved into a co-escalation with the parent. So the parent gets mad, the child gets mad, the parent gets mad, the child gets mad. Sometimes the parent gets really mad, the child gets quiet. And unfortunately, what that does is it starts to reinforce the parent to thinking, okay, it worked, right? I finally got them to do what I'm asking. But the child's not cooperating. He might be moving into a little bit of what we call freeze, and then he's moving back to what he or she was doing before. And what we want to do instead is to teach the child, why is it important to do X? Why are we trying to change what you're doing? So that the child understands that there's other people involved, there's other perspectives, and that even when things are going south, they observe that the parent knows how to regulate all those emotions. That's the really important thing that we're teaching in these moments, is that we don't want the parent to demonstrate to the child that when you get mad, you yell and you scream and you hit, which I do see some of our parents doing, or parents that move away from interaction. So with self-regulation parenting, we're really thinking about how do we move with our child? How do we join our child, find that place of commonality, and help them to experience the world in safe ways for each child?
So can you tell us, I think that a lot of us who are my age, people don't use timeouts a lot, and kind of have a sense that, that we should be more positive, that things should be really gentle, that we should be really working with the child. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to what happens for both the parent and the child when the parent puts the kid in timeout, or for a 5-minute thing, or like whatever it is that people are doing, where the child is by themselves having some time outside of the social interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to have you go back into your own childhood and think about, if you remember as a child, what it was like when your parent would lecture you. And you're probably going to remember very little of those lectures. Because most children, when the parent starts to lecture and tell them something, they actually move away from the interaction and they zone out in that moment. So when you put a child into a timeout, the parent is thinking, oh, the child's going to sit and think about his inappropriate behavior, and he's going to, that's why we call it a thinking corner now instead of a timeout. He's going to think about what he just did and how bad and terrible it was. And that's going to help him realize the next time when he has those same feelings not to do that. That's what we're thinking. But unfortunately, what's happening from the child is in this moment of stress, when the child is really upset and his low point and his behavior is inappropriate, he needs our connection. Our connection is what's going to drive that child to a different level of behavior. And if instead we take our connection away, we're telling our child that when you're upset, you're not worthy of my connection. And we're trying to do just the opposite.
Yeah, okay. So a little bit ago, you talked a little bit about making the child red or making the child blue. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Absolutely. So when I talk about somebody moving into a red zone, and we do a lot of teaching around this during the 12-week course that I offer, when we talk about the red zone, we're talking about something that comes from the work of Leah Cooper's with zones of regulation. And the red zone is a place where I'm moving into very large upset. I might be tantruming, I might be screaming, I might be crying, I might be hitting, I might be kicking, I might be throwing. And we see that with a child, and we often call it a temper tantrum. And when we see it with an adult, we say, oh, she's really mad right now. And actually, it's the same thing. So when I talk about, an adult moving into the red zone, it's often because a child has moved red, the parent has tried all the tools they know how to try, and they're stuck. And so then they try to move the child by yelling and screaming at the child. So we've just demonstrated to the child that in these moments of greatest upset, if you move to loud screaming, somebody will pay attention to you. And the point of this course is to really move to in a different way with young children and with teenagers, so that we respect who they are as human beings, we respect all the emotions that they have to share, and we teach them appropriate ways to share. And we have to do this first by thinking about ourselves and thinking about what is co-regulation. And I'm going to first start by saying that regulation is when, as a human being, I'm at my most flexible and stable learning level. So when I'm flexible and stable, if you throw me a curveball, I'm okay. I can manage it. I might be a little upset, but I don't move into a tantrum. That would be the green zone, right?
Okay, so right now we're talking about that tool card that you got in your email. If you, for some reason, didn't get it, you can go to www.positiveparenthood.org/resources and download it for your reference, just so you can kind of have a visual for what we're talking about.
So when you're in that green zone, you're flexible and stable. And when you're approaching your child who perhaps has just done something at the park, as Chelsea said, and is not being flexible and stable, and perhaps your child's not in that green zone, our first step is to think about attunement. And we have to help the child learn to attune to those people that are around them. And we do this by our presence, by giving our children our presence. And I think this is the hardest thing for parents in this situation, because maybe the parents are talking to other parents and they may not feel like they necessarily want to engage with their child in this moment. And in fact, in that moment, when your child has moved to an upset and some kind of inappropriate behavior, your job is to attune to your child, because he or she is the most important in that moment. And we do that through our presence by being fully committed to attending to what does the child need right now? What is he communicating to me through his behavior? How can I bring empathy to that so that we have this felt sense of togetherness? And from that place, I can give my child some information about what he or she might do differently given that emotional set. So it's okay to be frustrated that you didn't get to win the game. That's appropriate. But what we want to help your child to know is when you're feeling that, you can come to me and I'll give you a tight hug. We can go for a fast walk. There's lots of different ways we can regulate together, which is why we don't go to timeout. I want to teach that child that when you're feeling stressed and when you're feeling upset, you go to a person. You don't actually move away from a person, because when you move away is when any kind of lesson or instruction is lost. All children need to remain in that. Um,
Yeah, so let's talk about that because let's imagining just that you're at the park. I think it's true that most parents are under a lot of stress right now in the world. There's many, many stressors. If you live in the Bay Area like we do, there's a lot of financial stressors. Elsewhere, that's true too. People are working really long hours. You might be parenting by yourself. You might have a kid that's really hard. And something that I hear a lot from people in my world when I get frustrated or stressed out with my kids is that you're doing good enough. Like it's okay. You're doing the best you can, and that's going to be okay for your kids. And I think that that is true for a lot of people. That just doing what you can is good enough. I do think some of us have situations or children for whom that's not good enough, and um, and I think this kind of parenting is a lot more intensive. And it takes a lot more work, and it also means that sometimes I have to break my own social connections with the other parents that I'm trying to hang out with while my kids try to hang out with their kids at the park. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that. Like, um, how do you know that your child needs more than good enough parenting, and what does it mean to make a shift away from sort of what most people are doing into this kind of situation, this kind of approach.
so, there's a lot of research about good enough parenting, and it works for many, many children and many family systems. And that's really where we parent, in a way, by the seat of our pants or by reading a lot of books and trying to do the very best that we can. But for some families, and many of the families that I've looked at, good enough parenting isn't good. The climate in the home is so upset and wrought with screaming and yelling and children crying and parents screaming and yelling back at children. And that's the moment where we say, well, is this what I want my home to be? And our home is supposed to be that safe place of security, where we feel comfortable, where our children feel comfortable. And so if in that moment we're, instead of screaming and yelling at our children, we're joining and connecting with our children, we're going to have a different outcome from our kids. Most of our kids need our connection, and it's the way to really support the best development forward. So I appreciate that what you said, Chelsea, that sometimes you have to break your connection in that moment. And you're right. And the way I say, how do you know when your child needs something? Sometimes they call to you. Sometimes they look to you with teary eyes, right? Sometimes they scream. Sometimes they throw sand. Sometimes they hit another child. Sometimes they, yell out or push a child. All those are moments to say, okay, if those things are happening, that's my moment to recognize that my child needs more than what I'm giving him right now. And in reality, what we value most are our families. And so we have to say, well, how do I nurture my child? What's most important? Is this 5-minute conversation talking about stress with my friend that feels good to me as an adult most important? Or does what my child need in this moment the most important? And what I'll say is, remember that, even on the airplane, what they always say is we have to take care of ourselves. So we have to be sensitive to where we are in our own state of emotional regulation before we can help our child. And so, as they say on the airport, you also always have to put your own mask on first before you put one on your child, because you have to be in a ready state to provide what your child needs. And that ready state for me is that place where you're in that green zone, where you're completely calm. Your child might be very upset, but you're able to move in to add the right support to your child so that your child feels your warmth and your connection and your presence and doesn't feel any negativity or edge from you in that moment.
So that's a great segue. I want to talk about, okay, so specifically when the child is having some kind of really big upset and the parent starts to get frustrated and wants to intervene, it sounds like, and I know from your approach, like the first thing that you would want them to do is for the parent to be able to control themselves. Yeah. And once the parent is calm, what would be the next step that you would recommend?
Well, I wouldn't pass that step so fast because that's really a big step in all of this. How does the parent stay calm when perhaps their child has just thrown something into, onto another child, dumped sand on their head, or dumped, hit them with a shovel or something? It's hard to stay calm. And so I think we all have to think about what do we say to ourselves in that moment in order to stay calm. And we talk to families about finding their own sort of calming phrase that they say to themselves. And what I say to myself in that moment is just And it's a moment for me just to pause and to think, gosh, there's something about this interaction that the child doesn't understand, because our children are doing as well as they can. And if there's an inappropriate behavior, then my job is to say, okay, he or she, this child, needs more from me in this moment to know how to interact appropriately. They don't choose to deliberately bang someone on the head for the fun of it, right? They do that because maybe they feel like they've been slighted, they're not getting the attention and the connection that they want from their parent or from their friends. And so they move into an inappropriate behavior. And our job is to teach them, what do you do with those feelings? Do you act those feelings out so that there's inappropriate actions? Or do you work for connection in those moments with somebody that's a secure base for you?
Yeah, okay. So let's take a second to go back to the worksheet that you got. So there's a worksheet that says at the top of it, why timeouts will always fail and how to build resilience instead. And again, if you don't have that or you're watching the replay, you can go to www.positiveparenthood.org/resources and download it. And let's just take a second to think about what it is that you can do to calm yourself down when you're starting to feel frustrated with your child. So I think it's different things for different people. But it's important to think about this because you can't give your child something that you don't have. So
Exactly.
you can't give your child something you don't have. So like if you don't know how to read, you're not going to be able to teach them how to read. If you don't know how to do math, you're not going to be able to teach them how to do math. And if you don't know how to manage your emotions, you're not going to be able to teach them how to manage their emotions. So you'll see at the top of this worksheet, there's a box and it says, when I'm upset, I like to calm down by. I want you just to take a second and think about that. What is it for you that helps you calm down? And while you do that, I'll share that for myself. I think the thing that works the best for me is yoga. Now I will say that I like a 90-minute yoga class, so that's not like always readily available to me when my child is dumping sand on another kid's head at the park. But there are things that I've learned in yoga that are readily available to me, like there's breathing exercises, there's postures that I know that I really like, and I can do those when my child is dumping sand on another child's head. So what is it for you? And maybe you can share one thing that you like to do to calm down while we just give people a chance to think.
Absolutely. So for me, there's a number of things that work that calm me down. One is to go for a walk. And sometimes a fast walk is what helps me in those moments, just to sort of let that negative energy flow through my body so that I can come back and engage more appropriately. Another thing that works to help me calm is gardening. So I like to work in the garden and feel the dirt and, water my plants and pull the weeds, and all of it is just ways to bring my presence to myself in that moment. Because once I bring the presence to myself, I can recognize that when my child is having an upset, I can bring my presence to them.
Cool. So once you've got that, I want you just to take a second and think about what it is that your child likes to calm down with. So what are the strategies that work for your kid? And they might be the same as yours, and they might be different. And it might be that your child is still trying to figure that out, or you're still trying to figure that out with your child. And so we'd invite you to keep thinking about that and open the conversation with your child about that. But for right now, just trying to think about for yourself and in your own family, what is it that calms your child down? So when I think about my 3 kids, it's kind of different for all 3 of them. Um, one of my children is really physical, I would say, and she really likes movement, and so if she's really upset, it's good for her to have some movement. So she might like to run or to skip or to do something physical. Um, Another one of them really likes to be held, so she might need to just to be held and squeezed and have her back rubbed. And I think that's different for all children too.
I can remember one child I worked with who was almost 5 at this point, and he was having an upset moment, and I was with him, and I said, "Gosh, what would help right now?" And he said, "Nothing." And I
Mm.
said, "Okay, let's do nothing together." And we sat together for probably 5, 10 minutes, and then he looked at me and he said, "A hug would help." And I said, "Okay, I could give a hug." And so sometimes we can suggest through ourselves what might help. We might say, sometimes when I feel like that, I like a hug. I don't know if that would work for you. It might, but it might not. And providing that as an option and allowing the child agency so that he can choose, do I want to try that on to see if it helps me feel better, or do I not want to try it on? Really helps. We need to give our children choices in these moments, just like we give ourselves as adults. I also want to be sure to bring in what we're trying to teach is resiliency. How do we support kids lifelong into approaching problems and knowing how to solve them? And I know some people will say to me, but if I give a child a hug after he's had an upset, aren't you just reinforcing that behavior? And actually, what I would say to you is that I'm reinforcing the child. I'm saying to the child, I hear you. I understand this is really hard right now. I'm here with you. I'm going to help you be safe together. And important to think that just like if we found an adult in a room, somebody that you love a lot that was very upset and they were crying or hitting something or breaking something, you wouldn't start yelling and get mad at them. Instead, you would come over and maybe put your arm on them or touch them with your hand and say, "Hey, you okay?" Right? And you'd have that soft tone. And our children need that same thing from us. So to be sure, I don't think this is reinforcing inappropriate behavior. And children that are parented this way really learn to understand themselves, which is what drives the resiliency, which we want for all of our children.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I just want to take you through the rest of the worksheets that you've gotten. So what we're talking about is misbehavior really as stress behavior. And so I just want to give you a moment to think about what the thing is that your child does. Like, what is the behavior that they have at the park or at home or like wherever it is that really is challenging for you? Is it that they can't, is it that they can't share something with a sibling? Is it that they always want to climb up the slide and you want them to only go down the slide? Is it that they run away from you when you tell them it's time to go? Just take a second to think about what that behavior is and when it happens the most. Um, and I'll let you talk for a minute about the stressors that kind of cause that kind of behavior and what we can do to remove them. I also want to say before she talks about that it's really important to do some planning around this. So like identifying what it is and what you want to do. When it's not happening, like ahead of time, like now, gives you a chance to make a plan so that in the future you can deal with it differently. And sometimes when we're outside of whatever the challenging dynamic is, it's easier to identify what the stress is and to think about what you can do to remove the stress. I also want to say that it might seem like your child shouldn't be stressed by something that you feel like is causing a lot of stress. And that's fine. That's a judgment that you have. But when we find ourselves saying things like, oh, but it shouldn't matter so much, or they should be able to deal with that, I think it's just good to drop those because they should or they shouldn't, but they are being stressed by it. So if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of stress that a lot of kids experience and the ways that parents can remove them, that would be great. And then we'll wrap up.
There's lots of different kinds of stress that children experience. Sometimes it's biological. And by biological, I mean that the child is physically tired, or the child is physically hungry, or maybe he or she has a cold. Something is wrong with their basic biology. And that could make them less capable of handling those small bumps in the road that they're navigating in the park. Sometimes it's related to, language delay and children not knowing and understanding sort of the nuances of communication, but catching the nonverbal or the tone that somebody's unhappy with them and responding in the same way back. Sometimes it's, kind of the psychosocial kinds of challenges where the child doesn't understand, really what's going on in social interactions, and they need support in understanding, well, if you throw sand on his head, that isn't going to make him want to play with you. That's going to actually make the child move away from you. And so we know that in those moments, the child can't take all that language or all that information in. And what I have to think about is, what does my child need? If this is the stress, if the stress is that he's hungry, I need to make sure he's fed. If the stress is that he doesn't understand what's going on in the social environment, I need to be there to translate for him. So we actively want to think about, how do we remove that stress from the child? How do we take away their stress? Because my goal is to help the child navigate that situation in a positive way, because that builds the resilience that we need for the next time. If every time they approach a problem and they have this negative outcome at the park, going to the park won't be so fun, and they won't know how to manage and what to do when a child says something with that edge in their voice. And instead we can teach them, oh, I don't like your voice right now. It scares me, right? We can teach them to say something that's soft and meaningful to the intention of the child. So
Yeah, so I would just encourage you to use this worksheet as you think about how you want to put this into play in your own life. I would love, if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and write them in the chat and we will answer them. Otherwise, sorry, there's like a truck that's about to roar by. So just be prepared for that. You can let us know if the questions are in the chat. Otherwise, I just want to say that if this seems like a style of parenting if this seems like a style of parenting that speaks to you, and that if you feel like you would like to have more of this kind of support, we have a couple of different courses launching in February. We have an online course for those of you that are not in the Bay Area. And then we also have a general course for people with kids 18 months to 21 years, and a big kids and teens course for kids who are 10 years old to 21 years old.
I want to get in the pool.
You want to get in the pool? We're going to go swimming really soon. Do you want to say hi really fast? Okay. Yeah. So it's time for us to go swimming. But thanks so much for being here with us.
I'm getting in the pool in the lake now.
Yeah, we're gonna go in just a minute. Thanks so much for being here with us. There is actually a discount available to you. It's 10% discount. It's only available through Saturday night.
You something.
So if you would like to grab your spot in the February class, and you want to show me something, and you want that discount, it's important to make sure that you sign up today. Any questions, shoot me an email, chelsea@positiveparenthood.org. And you can also check out our website at www.positiveparenthood.org.
Mama, come.
it's hard for children to wait. We do a whole class on waiting, and Luna's struggling with waiting right now.
Mama, come.
So we're gonna go swimming. I hope you have a really wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mama, come. I want to show you